Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Large reservoirs like Millerton Dam and Pine Flat in the valley are essential for managing water in California's increasingly variable climate. Of course, they provide many benefits, but the greatest among equals is increasing our supply of water. Some say, however, at what cost to the environment? And as things begin to heat up, both environmentally and politically, does California need a new approach to managing dams so that they still can deliver the water that we all rely on while minimizing the damage to the environment? That's the question posed by a recent study done by the non-partisan Public Policy Institute of California. Our guest is Dr. Sarah Null, who authored that report and is a senior fellow at the PPIC, as well as a professor at Utah State University, specializing in environmental water management. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So can you explain a little bit about California's freshwater ecosystems? What are they? Why are they important? And what's their current status?
Yeah, California is full of freshwater ecosystems, but they're in decline. So when I talk about freshwater ecosystems, I mean everything. I mean rivers, wetlands, lakes, and the benefits we get from those ecosystems. California has the most variable and diverse plants and animals in the state. And we have many aquatic species that live nowhere else except for California. So it's important to manage them, and it's important to manage water for people.
Yeah, but before we get into a discussion about dams and their impact on the ecosystem, you often hear about water being wasted and allowed to simply flow out to the ocean. So I wanted to touch on the flows out of the delta to the bay and the ocean and the issue of salinity maintenance. That is, using water to keep the delta water fresh enough for exports and for local ag and for urban demands. Can you explain why that's so important?
Yeah, in California, when we're talking about managing salinity through the Bay Delta, that's usually not for ecosystems, that's for people. And that's because pumps pull water down to the San Joaquin Valley and even portions of Southern California through those pumps. So we want to keep that water very fresh. We don't want the tidal influence to come up into the bay and have brackish or salty water there. So what that means is that we flush the Bay Delta with fresh water to make sure that the water that is delivered to cities and farms, stays fresh. Okay, so that salinity is a little bit different than ecosystem maintenance.
Okay, so let's talk about the impact of dams on freshwater ecosystems. To start, let's just talk about how important dams are to California's water management.
Yeah, dams are instrumental to California. We could not manage water for people and keep people safe without dams. So we have over 1,500 dams in the state, provides about 40 million acre feet of water. With those dams, we do flood risk reduction. So we try to stop big floods for people. We provide water to cities and irrigation water to farms. There's water for recreation, there's water for hydropower, and there's water for ecosystems. And those are a lot of uses to manage simultaneously.
And I think in your report, there are 1,500 reservoirs, so it's not like one or two, there are quite a few. So I'm not sure that people are aware of the numerous regulatory and planning efforts when it comes to the valley's dams, for example. Can you describe just a few?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of regulatory constraints that go along with that. So there are state constraints and federal constraints, but some big ones are that we have 2 big water projects in the state, the California Water Project, the State Water Project, and the Federal Water Project, the Central Valley Water Project. So with those, there are many constraints and regulatory requirements so that we don't wipe out species in the way that we manage water for people. We have things like the environmental flows framework, where we're trying to think about, what are the big objectives that we want to manage for the environment and what flows are necessary to provide them. We have Proposition 1, which is state bond funding, which which allocated almost $3 billion for storage projects or water management projects that include some public benefit. And often the public benefit is environmental ecosystem protection.
It seems that there's a lot.
So that's just a few of them, but we have a whole lot of regulatory ways that we manage water in California.
Yeah, it seems that there's a lot of rules, and are they simpatico, as it were? Sometimes a question. You know, in your report, you talk about the, quote, paradox of managing water storage for the environment, unquote. What did you mean by that?
Well, dams are not good for ecosystems, and we've known that for decades. So when we build dams, we fragment rivers so that migratory species or species with particular habitat needs can't get up to the places that they need to. So for example, think of trout or salmon that migrate through a river that might come up through the delta, and they might need to get to the headwaters where water is nice and cool and fresh and there's water all year round. Dams block that passage, and so it really limits the habitat access that species have access to. It limits the cold water access. So we have on one side that fragmentation. But at the same time, because of all the regulatory requirements that I just spoke about, we need dams now to release water from dams to provide water for those regulated flows. So that's what I mean by the paradox. In one way, dams harm ecosystems, and another, we're reliant on dams to provide the right quantity and quality of water.
Okay, well, up next, we're going to talk about more about the dam's effect on the environment. Does it matter? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. It's been noted that dams are a major contributor to the decline of California's rivers. Some numbers: 80% of the native freshwater fish species in California are in decline or at risk of extinction by the end of the century. More than a quarter are in critical risk of extinction. This data comes from a recent report issued by the non-partisan Public Policy Institute of California. We're talking with Utah State professor Dr. Sarah Null, who is the senior fellow at the PPIC and an expert in environmental water management. So, as you know in your report, quote, California will need to rely on for the indefinite future on dams, unquote. And as we've discussed, there is a paradox that you say is best illustrated by the plight of salmon and steelhead. Can you explain?
Yeah, so salmon, some species used to go up into headwaters to rear for the summer into nice cold water. They can no longer access that habitat. So that's where dams have hurt ecosystems and species. But now dams provide water for trout and salmon, and they also provide cold water because large reservoirs at depth have nice cold water that we can release that really fills the place of those headwater systems. So we rely on dams, and dams also impact habitat and species.
You know, a major challenge to water management are temperatures, as you mentioned, for salmon. So why is that such a problem, and does it have the potential to get worse?
Yeah, great question. So salmon require cold water all the time, year round. So they used to go up into places where there are springs or up into headwaters closer to up in the mountains. They can't do that. So now we have to manage our large reservoirs where we get cold water at the bottom. Even in the summer when we have warmer water on top, we'll have nice cold water in the summer. And we release that cold water little by little just to sustain the salmon and provide places of cold water refuge for them to persist through the summer.
You know, your report suggests that the use of water for environment purposes is currently viewed as a constraint on reservoir operations. But instead, you suggest that environmental water should really be a primary objective of good water management. Some may see that as a distinction without difference, frankly. Is this a zero-sum game? More water for the environment purposes means actually that there's going to be less water for agriculture and urban users?
To some extent it does. To some extent we need to think about who or what objectives we release water for out of our reservoirs, what we're managing water for. Sometimes we might have multiple benefits, and sometimes that's the case, that say we could make hydropower and release water for species, or we could release water for species, and at the end of the system we could divert that water for cities or agriculture. So sometimes we have multiple use, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes there are difficult trade-offs.
Yeah, and then that's you know, what do they say? You know, in California, whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. I mean, it's constant, that battle between ag and the environmental needs and farmers. And frankly, it seems to me that we've maybe overpromised everyone. Everybody's going to get 100% of what they want, and it seems like you're going to have to balance that out to some extent. And those are hard discussions to have. So you cite the federal Central Valley Project and the State Water Project operations as examples. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so all of those reservoirs and all of the conveyance that was built in the state and the Central Valley Project, those were primarily not built to sustain ecosystems. So dams were built for flood risk reduction or for water supply or sometimes hydropower. And then later we realized what we were doing to our ecosystem. So later we had some regulations come on top that said, we can't dewater streams, or we have to provide cold water for ecosystems so that these species can still persist. So those came later, and there's really no water rights for the environment. There's regulations, and those are helpful, but they're rigid and inflexible. And so at times during drought, for example, or when we have errors, operational errors or forecasting errors, we really can't go back. And it tends to be the ecosystems that water gets shorted for. Water gets shorted for everybody, but also for the ecosystems.
Yeah, that's a really critical thing that you were saying, that errors in reservoir forecasting and operations are increasingly common, and that's a problem. Well, up next, there are all sorts of demands on stored reservoir water: economic, environmental, even recreational. How do you determine the right balance? We'll find out in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Dr. Sarah Null. She's with the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California about allocation of water for environmental purposes. The key questions seem to be how can we allocate water for environmental purposes and do it in a way that still meets the water needs of others, such as households and farms. An important tool that you talk about, Sarah, in your report is how to most effectively and efficiently store water for the environment, something called an ecosystem water budget. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, that's a funny sounding name, but an easy idea. Basically, we wanted to think about giving the environment assets. So the environment has no water rights right now, and we wanted to say, what if we give the environment or ecosystems a proportion of inflow? For example, 10% of the inflow, 20%, 30%. And then we experimented more with saying, what if we give the environment a proportion of reservoir storage to manage that water? And then in some runs, we did a bunch of model runs to test these ideas. And we said, what if we make sure that reservoir storage never drops below a certain level to protect the cold water, to maintain cold water in large reservoirs? So we experimented with giving the ecosystem 3 different assets, and together we call those ecosystem water budget.
Yeah, so this environmental water budget, though, it does actually ask for something. What it's asking for basically is a way to implement it. So what are the various governance structures you're going to have to deal with to get this implemented?
Yeah, so we came up with 3 main ideas here. The first is that the operator could implement this. And so we could say, all right, reservoir operators, this is one more job on your plate. They would be, an obvious person in some places because they're already managing the reservoir. Or we could say maybe agencies could do this. So for example, in California, there's the Department of Fish and Wildlife. They're the regulators of ecosystems. So they might be an appropriate person to be this manager. Or we could say you could have what we call an independent trustee. So somebody who comes on, who coordinates with people, who works with the operator, and their job is solely to protect this environmental water budget.
So what are the various pluses and minuses of each option? Does one stand out as the best one overall?
I think so, but I'll go through the pluses and minuses first. So for the first, if we use the operator, it's kind of like the status quo. I think there's some, it's common to seek compromise. And so we might be trusting an operator who has no background in ecosystem management. That might not be their forte. They might say, I'm going to balance, scarcity, and that might be an appropriate way to do it. There could be conflict of interest where an operator is maybe managing differently than an ecosystem manager would, for example. So then that brings us to the agencies. The agencies know a lot about managing water for the environment, and so they would bring a lot of skill and expertise. There could also be a conflict of interest, for example, where, say, somebody sues this person and says you're not operating the storage or this flow allocation correctly, but then that agency is also the regulator. So then who would you go to really solve these problems? So because of that, we think the third option, an independent trustee, is really the best option. They could come in with expertise. They would have to coordinate with a lot of people and with the operator, but they might be in a good position to do that. And there is some precedent there, and that the San Joaquin River Restoration Program has a trustee, and so a really similar person is already involved in managing the San Joaquin River.
Now, it's an important consideration is how to expand the portfolio of water and storage options. In other words, how do we create more water? So what's your solution there?
Well, we don't create more water per se. I wish we could, but that's where things get really interesting, because in our modeling we did to test all of these ideas, we said, what happens if we give a proportion of storage to the environment? And what we found is that we could use less water because, say, the ecosystem needs 10 CFS, a river needs 10 CSF in May and 50 CFS in June. And maybe there's always 20 CFS allocated to the environment. So some months, too much water is maybe flowing down the river if we just use that proportion of inflow. And some other months we don't have enough. So by using storage, we could kind of reshape that water and use it most efficiently. And that's exactly the purpose of reservoirs. That's why we build them for irrigation and for cities and water supply at the same time. So we would be using a reservoir exactly how it's meant to be used.
So, big question. Who should be responsible for the cost of acquiring, storing, and administering this water for the ecosystem? It's a big issue.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right?
I think it's more than $1 million, but yes, it's a big question.
It's way more than $1 million. So in California, we have a history that water users pay for harm to ecosystems, harm to systems. So when water has to, come up for regulatory flows, we usually say that's the role of water users. However, when we say there's a river that's degraded and we want to do some restoration, that's usually where we seek outside funding. Sometimes it's bond funding, sometimes it might come from NGOs, sometimes it might come from agencies. It comes from a whole host of areas. But so we fund restoration and stream flows in different ways. So I would say that there'd be the same proportion. We would in some places say users pay for this, and other times we would go to bond funding or other sources.
All part of the negotiations, I guess. Well, up next,
Yep.
So what are the key takeaways regarding the trade-offs that would be required if reservoir water was set aside for an environmental water budget? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Professor Sarah Null, an expert in environmental water management with the non-partisan Public Policy Institute of California, about how the freshwater ecosystem needs of our lakes, rivers, floodplains, and wetlands can be addressed and still meet the human needs for water. In short, how can we reverse the decades of decline in our natural water infrastructure while still meeting our needs? The focus of your report was on the idea of creating and managing an environmental water budget. We just talked about that. You did some pretty complicated modeling to come up with several takeaways. Your first takeaway was that relying exclusively on bypass reservoir inflow without storage would be a less efficient way to meet environmental objectives. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, it means that using storage to manage and reshape flows for the environment uses less water overall. So we could have a little bit of less water allocated to the environment if there's storage to manage that water.
So, another takeaway was that setting a combined environmental water budget with a portion of inflow and a portion of storage space was a more efficient way to meet environmental water demands. How so?
So that was important because not only could we use water a little bit efficiently, so we needed a little bit less water to meet environmental demands, we also could maintain stream temperatures, specifically cold temperatures for species like salmon and trout.
That issue, that temperature issue, is obviously a really big issue when it comes to that. It's not just the quantity; it's kind of, I guess you would say, the quality of water too, or the temperature of the water. Yet another takeaway that you stated was establishing a water budget, the cost that it has for water users, particularly junior water rights holders. What's the impact there? What's the situation?
Yeah, so this idea isn't making new water. It's changing the priorities and changing how flexible we can be in our water management. But the junior water users really are the ones that take the hit, and there are large trade-offs for junior water users, especially if we were to allocate a proportion of reservoir storage to junior water users. And so we need to think about that to maintain everybody and to keep them whole. And one aspect of that I think is important for this report, we wanted a really hard case. And so we looked at reservoir storage, but there is underground storage. There's things like Prop 1 reservoirs that have yet to be built. So we might have more storage in the space in the state. So there are some other options for managing storage.
Yeah, I just want to just focus on that a little bit, the groundwater storage. I think a lot of people forget that there's water beneath our feet. And that seems to me, and again, I'm not a water expert. And by the way, I was telling you off camera that of all the programs we do, water is one of the most complicated, most difficult ones to deal with. But it seems to me that groundwater banking makes a lot of sense. It seems to be a very economical way to store a lot of water. And then if you don't store it, then you have subsidence and you lose those aquifers for the future. So that seems to make some sense to me as a person who's admittedly not an expert in water policy like you are. Let me ask you this. You caution that the simulations that you use provide some insights, but they shouldn't be used to establish percentage of inflow and storage space to manage. Any concerns there? I mean, you think that maybe, but water budgets, they do need numbers. So how should the numbers be chosen?
Well, yeah, and that was our goal, was to provide numbers, because we can't just talk about ideas and say, maybe this is a good idea. We wanted very much to provide numbers. It was also beyond the scope in 1 year to create a model of every reservoir of California. So we created a fairly simple model that was complex still. It had senior water users and junior water users and different environmental objectives. But the state has a number of very sophisticated models. So those are, for this idea to really move on to the next step, I would say we could use some of those existing complex, sophisticated models to further test this idea.
Yep, the models are a great place to start. Well, I want to thank our guest, Dr. Sarah Null. She's a senior fellow with the Public Policy Institute of California, for joining us. If you want to keep up with state and local politics, just sign up for our free e-newsletter at the Maddy Daily by logging onto our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.